Are you embracing God's sense of his time in its time? Listen, we live in a crazy time in history of this world. Things are tough for many people, and it seems as though we're coming to the midst of some major world changes. I think that's true. This is going to entail some trials, some tribulations, and perhaps some level of suffering and pain. Today, I'm going to share with you through the words of Preacher Solomon in his time, that this time, ladies and gentlemen, will too pass, because it's a season that's ordained by God, and as such, each season is necessary in order to usher in the next according to God's will. Why? Because everything happens in its time. Greetings, everybody. I'm Stephen Garofalo. This is Reason for Truth, the channel and organization that helps you, both Christians and non-Christians, to cut through the fog of culture's distorted truth. Because in our relative world, the truth doesn't change, folks, but the human will to distort it does. We cut through the distortion of current events with the truth as an antidote for you to the false messages that are so pervasive in our world today. And as you know, we say Reason for Truth, always where the truth comes first and the reasons come last, but we're always and constantly learning, because when we stop learning, we stop teaching, or at least stop teaching well. And before we get started, make sure you do a couple things. May it subscribe, share this with others. Did that little tickle, that little alert bell down there. You won't regret it, promise you. All right, subscribe, alert bell, boom. Listen, Ecclesiastes 3, 1-12, some powerful verses. This is what we're going to look at as our truth text today. Today I'm just going to cover, these are like 13 or 15 verses. I'm going to just break this in two because it's too long and nobody wants to sit and have 2 cups of coffee and listen to me. Maybe 1 cup of coffee you'll grant me, and I appreciate that. So we're going to look at, again, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. I mostly work out of the ESV and the NIV, if you're wondering. This is really a poem that speaks of eloquence, the role and time and the life of the believer. Some regard the book of Ecclesiastes as describing the life apart from God, but clearly this text describes life on earth and our life in relation to God. Now, through the words of Ecclesiastes, the preacher is not teaching that everything has an opportune time according to or regarding when exactly one should choose an action or another. We'd all love a FedEx to understand God's will or God's timing. That's not reality. Rather, and by design, by the way, rather he teaches us all that all events are in the hands of God, who makes everything happen in his time, meaning the time he judges appropriate, illustrating this point, which is by the way, comforting assertion for us that he can see things we can't, and he's all-powerful and in control. Now, the preacher uses 14 pairs of opposites from verses 2-8 really to make this central point that God is ultimately in control, but that we as human beings are God's vessels to carry out his will. That's important. Here's some people, well, God's going to do that. God's going to protect me. So I'm going to close my eyes, go out into the hood, and it just do my thing, right? You're going to drive and not open my eyes? Come on, right? God uses us as his vassals, right? Uses us to, and it's our privilege to do so, to be used as his servants. So in the end, the truth is that we have very little control over world events, right, as individuals, but we have a lot of control over the specific area or areas God's called us to his mission and his calling for each one of us that he gives us here during this short span of time that we call life. Now, the simple question today is this: will we move forward in obedience and action in fulfilling that mission? Well, that's up to you. That's up to me, right? Let's jump right in by reading the poem by Preacher Solomon, starting chapter 3, Ecclesiastes, verse 1. And he says this: there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do workers gain from their toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. And I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. That is Ecclesiastes 3, 1-12, NIV. We're not going to cover but about half of that. We're going to go, I think, to verse 4 or 5 today, because I think these are important for us. And understanding God's time on individual little morsels, because they're going to add up to us, I think, instead of just saying, well, just do this one thing. Let's look at some real-life examples God gives us through preacher Solomon. King Solomon. All right, before we jump in with verse 1, though, it's important to note that each verse in this poem has two parts of opposite events in life. Each opposite pairism is called a merism, a literary device highlighting the totality of something by indicating its two extremes, hot and cold, right? Black and white, young and old, and everything in between. The two pairs of opposites in each verse are thematically and focus on a significant feature of life under the sun. And Preacher Solomon starts with the most basic feature. I love this, the beginning and end of life. Get it wrong there? Listen, you're not going to understand this life journey. All right, now let's look more closely at verse by verse about what God is telling us here, and that God has a time for everything, both good and bad. All right, let's start off with Ecclesiastes 3, chapter 3, 1. Preacher Solomon, by speaking to in the span of time that we call or we deem or deemed by God as a season or a time. See, both words, season and time, are usually regarded as being specific points in time rather than a continuity of time. That's as important. The words under heaven speak to life under the sun. So it's not an ongoing thing that doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's not a continuity. It's a start point, birth, an exit point. Got an on-ramp and an off-ramp, right? Birth, death. Meaning the sphere in which human life is lived. That's life. The more simply put, one's lifetime, I guess. Verse 1 lays the groundwork for the remaining verses, and I think it's important we get it there, straight there forward. But that being said, let's start right in with opposites in verse 2. Verse 2, Solomon kicks off the first set of opposites in saying that there's a time to be born and a time to die. Now here God makes clear that in our human existence, there's a start point and a stop point, an entry and an exit point. In the end, this all plays out under the sun, under the hand of the living God, right? In the end of the day, folks, God knows when we'll be from eternity, knew when we be born, when we pass away. This is just as true, by the way, for nations as individual lives. Nations, if you look through history, have birth points. They're made great, then they have falls. They're made not great. See that happening right before our very eyes. I've seen it. Look at Rome, Italy, was once the center of world power. So was Great Britain. And the United States is, listen, we're being naughty. We better be careful. We're going to lose that position. I think God makes nations great. Man does not make nations great, according to his will and his time. Life and death, by the way, is being born and dying it's true, whereby all things follow the truth, these truth verses, everything, rests on this. You can't talk about anything else till you understand you're going to live, you die, you're going to suffer a little bit in between, you're going to have triumphs. Understanding that framework will help you understand the rest of the verses and everything you do in every day of life. So in the end, this gives us God's perspective on how we are to live properly today in light of their departure that will happen one day, unless the Lord returns and raptures us up. That'd be nice, but that may not happen. All right. Second part of verse 2, by the way, says that there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. What does this mean? This is saying the same thing. It's kind of like that human vegetation, right? It's saying the same thing, time to live, time to die. Well, it's saying, listen, plants are living creatures too. They're not humans. They don't have, souls. But, they're just plant life. But listen, at the end of the day, they do have an entry point and an exit point. And so God is making the point that all things created that are living, and they are living, has a start point and an end point. I think God makes that clear here so that we don't think there's anything else outside the humans that are going to that kind of defy this law of God's creation. So in the end, all life on earth, all life, is subject to the time of birth and a time of death. Now that God has established that truth, let's move on to verse 3, whereby God speaks to things that happen to us in our span of physical life. And verse 3 says that there's a time to kill and a time to heal. What Solomon's saying here is that there's a plan, in the plan of God, there's a time for executing murderers, Genesis 9:6, you read about that, and a time for going to war against enemies as designated by God. Now for those who kind of naively hold to the utopian belief that sinful man is capable of not going to war, I would submit that you're wrong and you're missing God's point here and his word, and that war more often than not is necessary to thwart evil. No one likes war, but Solomon makes clear that, listen, giving and taking a life are God's prerogatives. However, has given man corporate responsibility to carry out capital punishment in case of murder. We don't have a right to do that outside of God's parameters. Genesis 9:6 makes clear that whoever sheds the blood of man by humans shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. That's where that comes from. This dismantles well-intentioned Christian thought, by the way, for, first-degree murder, getting some kind of pass from capital punishment. Second part of this verse, verse 3, says that there's a time to tear down and a time to build. The words time to break down speaks to the fact that there is a time for dismantling walls, stone buildings, or even entire nations. Read about that in Isaiah 5:5 or Jeremiah 18, verses 7 and 9. This leads us to verse 4, which says that there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. This is a good one. Right? A time to mourn and a time to dance. Verses 3 to 4 speak to our weeping and laughing. Whether we like it or not, God's plan includes both sorrows and joys in life. In America and in much of the world, we try in vain to avoid sorrow, and in some cases we sin to avoid life's pain and suffering at all cost. What I don't understand is, but you especially see this in Hollywood, but not only Hollywood, and especially with the wealthy because they can afford it, but they will get more plastic surgery just to fight the crown of old age. And I understand no one wants to look older, but in a sense, God calls gray hair a crown, right? I mean, it's what are we fighting? And then we're spending money. What are we investing in doing that? Anyways, I can't blame myself or anyone else for trying to avoiding this, the train wreck, but we ought not reject, God's pruning of us in our life. And that includes growing older or his trials and tribulations, because if we don't, we become soft. Say if we don't allow God to prune, and if we don't allow ourselves the aging process to some degree. But as believers in Jesus Christ, we're not to mourn in the same way, by the way, as unbelievers. This is a point that it's important. The Bible tells us, 1 Thessalonians 4:13, this, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others, those are non-believers, do who have no hope. Believers have hope. Non-believers do not have hope. I should say authentic believers have hope. Those who in the name of Christianity, in the name only or religion, have no hope. That's just the truth. Then Solomon goes on to speak of the opposite of mourning, which is dancing and leaping. These things are natural ways of expressing laughter, pleasure, and joy in the presence of the Lord. Exodus 15:20 and Psalm 149:2 speak in detail to that. And in times of personal happiness, Luke 15:25 gives you the other side of the coin. So we need both mourning and times of joy, by the way. If we didn't have both these things, we'd be one-sided in our life, in our reality, in our relationship with God. It's just times of tough times that makes us good, makes us better. That those things in suffering and pain and pruning, that's not a good thing in the way we feel, but it has a good result. So, all right, I want to wrap it up there today. What I want to do is next time I want to pick it up in verse 5, and when we're going to talk about there's a time to scatter and a time to gather. And that's a big one. We want to pick up there at the intro. I want to challenge you, think about what we've said so far. There's a time for everything. What is going on in your life, right? What's going on in the world? Instead of crawling up in a ball and saying, it's the end, the good old days were great, let's look at how God has called us to be in this present world. God's strength is there. His word has not changed, folks, not one iota, and God is not taken by surprise by any of the world events. So I want you to just listen, be on your knees, be in prayer, be in God's word, and accept, all things are in God's hands. And remember, nothing stays the same, not here on earth. There's no such constant except for change. So appreciate you tuning in today's episode. Listen, make sure you do a couple things. Check out reasonfortruth.org, reasonfortruth.bible, and also check out our new partner here for doing online training. It's equippedacademy.com. Anyways, smash that subscribe button, alert bell. We're going to see you at the next episode for part 2. I'm your host, Stevie Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.